This week on the podcast, Malcolm Gerrie, an executive producer of some of the most innovative and influential music TV shows that come out of the UK. Now, people of my age, if they lived through the 80s, they will know a show called The Tube, which was compulsive viewing. He then went on to produce The White Room. He took over the BRIT Awards for many years and produced and elevated that show. And he even hosted a series of Talks Music on Sky Arts. Now, Malcolm's story is truly inspiring. He's not only worked with everyone, he's launched many careers because of the shows that he produced. And Malcolm is truly a fascinating man.
And he said, no, he said, listen, Malcolm, stop. She is a no priority act. Listen to me, watch the lips. I'm not going to help you. It's up to you. If you want to book her, speak to the US, bang, down with the phone. Tyne ended up owning, the first TV appearance of Madonna in the UK ever. The Tube became as big and as successful as it was because of that team. Absolutely. And given the freedom that Channel 4 gave us to push the envelope and do new things. But it was the team who had to deliver it. It sounds sort of glamorous going to Jamaica, taking Culture Club to Japan and walking on stage with Boy George. I remember he wore a wedding dress, and as he went onto the stage, he picked up his veil and just kissed the camera lens. Frankie Goes to Hollywood was another one. No one had ever heard of Frankie Goes to Hollywood. They didn't have a record deal. It went out on the Friday. On the Saturday night, I was at home in Peterlee. The phone rang, and it was Trevor Horn. And he said, Malcolm, that band you had on last night, it's just extraordinary. That song, that voice.
So stick with me for this interview. It's a really fascinating interview. And he talks about one legendary artist who did this.
He screwed the ends of all of the microphones and had them in his hand so nobody could listen to our conversation.
Don't forget to please subscribe. It allows you to find out when I've posted something new on the channel. And of course, it helps me. Now, without further ado, let's get on. Here is Malcolm Gerrie. So, Malcolm Gerrie, welcome. First of all, God, did those memories come back the moment I saw your face pop up. Anyhow, listen, I want to take you right back to your family, because one thing that I'm always interested in is when people are brought up within a family and whether their family had sort of any creative ideals or they valued a creative life. What sort of environment were you brought up in?
Well, I was born in Newcastle, and about 150 years ago, in the West End of Newcastle. It's quite a rough area, and Wingrove Road. And we had to move out when I was 5 because my mum had terrible asthma. And of course, all of the chimneys then, everything was coal fires. So the air was horrendous. It was like a C, what was it called, a pea super, as they called it in London, every day. And basically, I think when I was about 5 years old, the doctor said to my mum, to my dad, if you don't get her out of Newcastle, she's going to die. It was that bad. I remember vividly, even at that age, my dad hanging her out the window to try and get some air into her lungs, and it was hopeless. So we moved to this place called Peterlee, which is one of the new garden cities that they set up in County Durham, which was, all the houses were centrally heated, sorry. And it was right by the sea, so it was fresh air, and by this huge wood called Castle Eden Dean. And that was quite significant because not only did it save my mum's life, which was very significant, but also it was a kind of experiment. The garden cities were like a new experiment. And it was a mix of miners, because it was a massive mining community. That was the main job of work for people in the Northeast, that and shipbuilding. And this is before all the mines were closed, obviously. But there was a kind of feeling of this brand new town built in the, kind of what was just a bunch of fields, like 2 or 3 farms, were bought to make this new town. And the houses were all very modern, all designed by an architect. And and modernist sculptures in between the rows of houses, and yet you were surrounded by these, very, very traditional mining communities like Easington Colliery, Horden Colliery, Black Hole Colliery, Hettonley Hole Colliery, Black Hole Rocks, which wasn't a festival. It was a colliery village, and the fact that it felt experimental is significant because it actually had a very young feel to it. So as an environment to grow up with as a kid, it was exciting. It was different. And my dad was really, really, and I only realized this kind of later in life, was obsessed with music. And back in the day, and I'm talking about, in the 60s, early 60s, he would be listening to everything from Thelonious Monk to, he was obsessed with Frank Sinatra, Tony Bennett, Ella Fitzgerald, and yet also, like a lot of families, we had like South Pacific and Carmen Jones and Oklahoma in the record collection as well. And I used to wake up on a Sunday morning and I'd either hear Frankie, giving it some while my mum was making the bacon sarnies, or you'd hear a bit of Miles Davis or Josh White, or Django Reinhardt, and I guess it's just got into my DNA, to be honest, Steve. And the one treat that we had once every month was, because at the new town there was only one little place, Woolworths sold records, and there was a confectionery newspaper shop called Finlay's, and you could buy records there, but there weren't record shops, they were just, so albums were really hard to get hold of, and they weren't cheap.
I remember being a teenager, and at 13, for me, I mean, I just want to sort of ask you about an artist that may have changed your life, because I was a young gay teenager in the early 70s, insecure, didn't really know where I belonged. Along came Bowie, and it was the moment of belonging. It changed my life, not just his music, but actually him as a persona. And I just wondered if there was an artist that made you feel like, this is where I belong in this somewhere. Do you know what I mean?
Well, I mean, the obvious one, which I think just blew everybody's head completely off their shoulders at the time, was the Beatles, just going back to that thing about records being difficult to get. There used to be a place in Newcastle, which was quite, it was like a good hour's drive from Peterlee, where you could rent records for a month. And it was a record library, and these were quite common. And it was just in somebody's house, but he had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of albums. And my dad and I would go there on a Saturday morning, and he'd pick the albums for the month ahead, and then you'd return them at the end of the month, like a library, just like a library. And you got fined if you scratched them or anything else. But I remember getting my first Beatles album, because obviously I'd heard them on the radio, and it's like, wow, what's this? And then getting that first album was obviously like, this is something extraordinary, There've been so many artists since then, Steve. You mentioned David Bowie. I mean, it's just too many wonderful, wonderful artists to mention. But I think, for me, it was probably waking up in the morning, listening to Sinatra, which just got into my bloodstream. That probably was a life changer. And then hearing what the Beatles did, which was to completely revolutionize songwriting and that whole phenomena, just was the beginning of popular culture, really, for my generation, for baby boomers. So I would say, somewhere between Frankie and Lennon and McCartney is probably the sweet spot.
I know you became a teacher. Why did you want to become a teacher? Was it something that you thought was a vocation that you wanted, or was it just a job to start with?
It's a great question. I mean, I went through the whole of university, like so many kids at the time, and I think still now, who I just didn't have a plan in my head. I just was not thinking about where this was going. And I did English and drama at uni, and then then you do your years teachers, training. But my thesis at uni had been about progressive education, about different ways of teaching kids. And because I'd been to 13 schools in my life, because my mum and dad moved, and we ended up moving all over the place, including to New Zealand. Mum and dad emigrated to New Zealand when I was about 11, and we stayed there for 2 weeks.
No,
because we hated the fucking place so much. It was like putting the clock back 50 years. As I think it was Clement Freud said, I went to New Zealand and it was closed. It was shut. And it's true. Friday night on at 6 o'clock, everything's shut. All the shops, cinemas, everything's shut apart from one thing. You couldn't get a drink. You couldn't go. The church stayed open.
Yeah.
And so I think, what was the question again? Sorry, Steve.
No, it was just that whether teaching was a vocation
or
it's something they just fell into.
Yeah, sorry, I'm doing a Joe Biden. Bloody hell.
Very timely.
So I'd been doing this thesis about progressive education, and in particular, I'd struck up a dialogue with a guy called A.S. Neal, who ran a school down here in the south of England called Summerhill, which had been hugely controversial because the kids ran the school. They had their own parliament. They decided on what the curriculum was. They decided on what lessons they did. They decided on the way that you punish people, everything, what you got to eat in the canteen. And this was a hugely controversial thing. And A.S. Neal wrote some books. Anyway, I struck up a dialogue with him, and I became really interested in different ways of teaching young people. And especially having come through some pretty hard areas myself, like Peterlee, and then I moved to later on moved to a very rough part of Newcastle. I went into a massive comprehensive school, and I just felt uneasy about a lot of the things that I was seeing, in terms of how you're trying to educate young people. So anyway, I'd heard about this guy called Dick Copland in a place called Ryop outside of Sunderland, who had taken an old, really traditional grammar school, the Robert Richardson Grammar School, Sir Robert Richardson, and just overnight abolished school uniform, abolished corporal punishment, let the kids do their own newspaper every morning, let the kids have their own radio station, and encouraged the arts as well as maths and English and sciences. And this was in a very traditional, again, another mining community. And the thing about those mining communities, yes, everybody votes Labour or did back then, and but they didn't like any kind of disruption, and so they were convinced that this guy was going to ruin their kids' education. I'm probably overstating it, but there was certainly a backlash against what Dick was doing, and because this fascinated me, so I applied for a job there, got the job, and it was just the most extraordinary experience, Steve. Just he gave you the freedom to approach the learning process in a different way.
Just 1 second. I just want to say something, because you just said a word which really hit me then about disrupting. Do you think you moved so many times? I think you said you moved 11 times or something with your family.
Yeah.
Do you think you became a disruptor because of having no stability?
You should be my therapist.
I'm too busy being my own, but yeah.
I think you're spot on. And I think, I've always loved people who, we've just been talking about the Beatles and David Bowie. Nobody could have disrupted the status quo more than those guys, the Stones, the Clash. When I booked the Clash for All Right Now, they never did television, they never did Top of the Pops, never ever did TV. And then they agreed to do this little music show I was doing up in Newcastle before the Tube. And I couldn't believe it, and the disruptors, whether it's Dali or, Picasso, whoever it is, they're fantastic and interesting people. So I think, yes, you're absolutely spot on. And Dick Copland, the head of this school at Ryop, certainly caused, disruption.
Yeah, he came in one day, didn't he, with Tommy, which must have been, I think it was released in 1971, the record, but the film came out much later. So he came in with this album and said, you got to listen to this. We need to do something. Tell me your initial thought.
Well, it was the funniest thing. It actually wasn't Dick. You're not far wrong. It wasn't Dick who brought the album in, the head. It was the head of music, who we'd done Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat, and we'd done all the stuff that traditional schools did, and it was all boring as hell. And George, he was called George Robinson, brilliant music teacher, but grumpy and a very short fuse. So you had to be careful what you said to him. Otherwise, he'd give you a slap. And, and he came in with this album and he said, "Oh, Malcolm, you've got to listen to this, man. You've got to listen. We've got to do this. We've got to do this." I said, "What is it? What is it?" It was a big album. And it was the orchestra. It was Tommy, the rock opera by The Who, and the full orchestral version by Lou Reisner. And I said, "Oh, I was going to buy this." And he said, "You've got to listen to it. We've got to do this." And I said, "But hang on, George, you haven't got the dots. It's just come out. Where you're going, there's no score." And he was like, "Fuck you. I can do the music. If you can't do the drama, I'm just going to do it as a straight musical." I was like, no, listen. Oh, no. So I said, "Let me go and listen to it. And I'll, if you haven't got a screenplay." Wait, George, calm down. I'm going to go and listen to it. I listened to it, blew my head off. And I thought, wow, we've got to do this. This is just perfect. And so I went back in the next day and I said, "George, okay, this has got to be our next project." He said, "Well, where do we start now?" I said, "Well, we've got to get the rights to do it. We can't just do it. All these other things like Joseph, there's a school version, there's a way." And I said, "So you said, what are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to write to Pete Townshend." And he went, yeah. And I said, "No, I am." So I wrote to Pete Townshend and he replied immediately and said, "I'd be honored if your school, Malcolm, would like to do this." I'd never met the man, never done anything like that before. And he said, "I'd be honored and I will send you a copy of the score." But he didn't send me a copy of the score. He sent the original score that Lou Reisner had used and had written on his notes to record the orchestral version. And these 2 or 3 huge books, like imagine Yellow Pages, but twice as high, and they arrived in, recorded delivery post. And George was like, "Oh my God, this is amazing." So cut a long story short, we were the headline in the national press and in the NME was the school that pipped Ken Russell to the post. And we ended up doing the show. It got huge interest. And then we got a call from the Who's office saying, "Look, after the show, Ken Russell's filming Tommy as the movie in the Lake District. Would you like to come over and meet, Roger and meet Ken, and you can watch some of the filming and bring the kid who played Tommy with you?" And I said, "Well, we've got a problem, because the way I did it was we had 2 kids play Tommy, one before he was deaf, dumb and blind, if you know the story. Yeah. And then another lad who was older after he became deaf, dumb and blind." Anyway, the Who's office said, no, bring as many people as you want. Come over, just come over. Which, was mind blowing. I mean, I was like, 24, 25? And, Roger met us and we had dinner with him, and Ken Russell organized this Hells Angels fight, which is in the scene, and the Hells Angels happened to come from Sunderland.
Did you keep that original score?
Well, that's a great question, Steve, because wind the clock forward about 30 years, and I was doing a big show called Stand Up to Cancer for Channel 4, which I'd brought over from America and sold it into Channel 4, and it was a big awareness fundraising project to raise awareness of every kind of cancer. And the Who wanted to record an insert for the American version, and they said, can we use your, would you produce it, Malcolm? And I said, yes, of course. And I was chatting to Pete Townshend after they'd done this insert into the American version, and he said, "Oh, we're setting up a kind of museum, and archive of all the Who." He said, and I said, "Oh, have you got everything?" And he said, "Well, no." He said, "You remember when you did the school version of Tommy?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, have you still got the copies of the score that I sent you? And I said, well, actually, Pete, you didn't send me the copies of Tommy. You sent me the original score. And he went, what? And I won't use the language that he used. It was pretty rich. And he said, where are they? And I said, I haven't got a clue. I said, George had them. Where's George? Newfoundland, I said. He lives in Newfoundland. And he went, he wouldn't still have them, would he? I said, I'll ask him. Anyway, George had kept them. I put George and Pete Townshend in touch with each other. And George, of course, gave them back to Pete. And Pete said, right, come to Madison Square Gardens, bring your family, all expenses paid. I can't believe this. He said, you have made my day, if not my year. To have got these back is wonderful. So it's a lovely little coda to that.
I mean, what's amazing as well is front page of NME. There you are, a teacher in a small school, doing a school performance, nothing to essentially promote like a big band or whatever, you know what I mean? And there you are, front page, and I think like the inside center pages of the NME.
It was the front page, and the headline was, it's got all the cast, it's got the Acid Queen, it's got Dirty Uncle Ernie, it's got the Pinball Wizard. And the headline, Steve, was school ever like this? And inside, it was 6 pages.
Wow. And
it was the biggest feature, written by Tony Stewart, a great writer. And Tony came out and said, Malcolm, you'd probably like to know this. It is the biggest feature the NME had ever run on anything in its history.
I've got it, and it's on the website. It's on the website of the school. I looked it up earlier.
Yeah.
You've got it on the wall.
On the wall as you walk into the house.
Now, working with kids at that period, and this is sort of, it's not really a tongue-in-cheek question, actually. It's like, what did learning, teaching kids and working with them at that period of your life give you in terms of working with pop stars later?
Brilliant. Probably everything. I probably learned everything in those 5 years when I was teaching at Rye, Steve, to be honest. Because the thing is, you walk into a classroom and you've got, in the case of the school I was at, 30 faces all waiting for you to fail. They're all waiting there, say, come on then, come on, do your job, educate me, but also I want you to make sure that I'm not going to talk to the little boy next to me, or look at the girl sitting at the next desk, or look out the window, or nowadays go on my mobile phone, and it's an exercise in several things. One, how do you engage with people? Secondly, how do you earn their respect and their trust so that they're not going to, give you any trouble? And I never had any trouble in the 5 years I was there. A lot of the older ex-grammar school people used to say, and I used to hear them in the staff room say, I'm going to knock such and such's head off if he comes anywhere. I was thinking, what? And the lad he was talking about was lovely kid. The last person I would have thought about knocking his head off. And just the language was so loaded, and it's the kind of leather arm patch on the tweed jacket brigade, and I think so. You learn how to gain trust, and how to be how to engage with people. But I think also the other thing I learned, which when you're dealing, I did a music show for Sky Arts called Talks Music, where I interviewed Nile Rodgers, Jeff Beck, Robert Plant, a whole Blondie, a stack of people. And I think the thing I learned there was it's important to know when to shut up, and just when to stop, because by listening and choosing your moment when you want to speak can be quite powerful. And that's something that discipline I learned at school. So you'd have some kid not having a go at you, but trying to make a point in a kind of slightly defiant way. And the worst thing was to stop him or interrupt him. And I just used to let him rant until they ran out of steam. And then you come in. And that's a skill. You've got that skill, Steve. You know, it's why you do what you do so well. It's you know, but it's not as easy as, you know. And you watch the election debates that are going on in the UK at the moment, and it's like, you know, they're both talking over each other, and it's a complete and utter waste of time. They both end up looking like knobheads because they're not making a point. You know, it just looks like childish bickering. So I think I learned a lot, I think, from teaching. And the other the thing I mentioned, trust before, is, you know, I've seen this happen so many times. You've just got to be honest with especially with talent, really big talented people, because they know, they can read it a mile off if you're not straight with them and sincere. And it doesn't matter whether it's Andrea Bocelli or it's John Lydon, you know. There's a great duet, by the way, for the Brits.
Beats Mick Fleetwood and Samantha Fox.
I think, you know, I think just being completely honest, and if, you know, they will. The first ever interview I ever did in my TV career was with Paul McCartney, and you know, I did a terrible thing. I said, I was so nervous. I'd never done this before. It was in Newcastle City Hall. And I'd worked out all my questions. I'd really done my homework. I'd done them over and over again. And then I just froze when the director said, "Oh, okay, action." So I ended up saying to Paul, you know, "Paul, have you ever been to Newcastle before?" And he went, "Excuse me?" Like, they've done about, you know, 24 dates as the Beatles, you know.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? There's that initial moment, that initial question or the initial contact will define the interview. It's incredible.
Exactly right.
I just want to get you back to the school because, you know, you did Stardust, and then David Puttnam rang the school, didn't he? He wanted to come to the event, and that was a sort of life-changing moment for you, really. Can you tell me about that and your initial meeting with him?
Yeah, I mean, after Tommy, you know, the rock opera, it was like, what on earth do we do to top that? Because it, you know, it caused, you know, we had an article in the Guardian about it, and all the local press, you know, went bonkers. So I'd seen this movie called Stardust, which a lot of people won't even know of now, unless you're my generation. That David Essex in it, and Ringo. And I loved the story. It was written by a brilliant writer called Ray Connolly, who is one of the definitive writers of, you know, of the Beatles, and he's written some great books on music culture and pop. And he'd written it. It was a really interesting story about a rock star, you know, classic thing, rising to huge fame, can't deal with it, locks himself in a castle in Spain, and then ultimately, you know, goes the way of so many, you know, famous rock stars. And I thought, oh, I wonder if you put a twist on that, and instead of him going to the rock star going to Spain, what about if he went to Bamborough Castle in Northumberland, which is this extraordinary castle where they've shot 1 million movies, big long beach, and said rock star, you know, ends up as a hermit in Bamborough Castle in Northumberland, and then ultimately, you know, goes away, pops his clogs. And but to do that again, I had to get permission. So I wrote to Ray Connolly, who said, "Yeah, of course, that was great. You want to do a school version of Stardust? Well, amazing." And that was it. I left it. And then because of the success of Tommy, the interest in what we were doing at the school by now was huge. And so, you know, we had a call from ITV. Remember, there was an art show called Aquarius.
Yeah,
like it used to be like the South Bank show.
Was it Russell Harty?
Yeah, Russell Harty. Yeah, and a brilliant director. His name I can't remember. David. It'll come to me. Anyway, we got a call from the Aquarius team and said, "We'd like to do a 10-minute insert for." And this is a network, big network, ITV1 show. We'd like to do an interview and see some of the stuff you do, Malcolm. A little 10-minute insert into our arts magazine program. I was like, wow, amazing. So we had a documentary crew right from the get-go following us, putting our version of Stardust together as a big school show. And then we got a call about 3 weeks before the show, and he said, actually, it's from the Stardust, from the Aquarius office saying, actually, Malcolm, no, we don't want to do this as an insert. I was like, oh, no, this is awful. We want the whole show. The whole show is going to be about what you and George are doing at this school up in this mining village. Are you happy with it? Is that okay? I'm like, yeah. I said, you better talk to the head, but that's amazing. So we get the show together, and the head, Dick Copland, said, right, Malcolm, George, I'm taking you off curriculum. This is how progressive and going. You're only going to work on the show for 2 weeks. No teaching. Just I want you and those kids who are involved in Stardust focus on this, because this is a great learning experience, which is amazing, And he had to get approval from the authorities who were, we're not sure of this. Anyway, we had all the local press and all the local radio and the music press all interested in what we're doing. So we put the tickets on for they were quite expensive. I can't remember what it was now, but it was a lot of money. It sells out. 5 nights sold out within like an hour. All the kids' parents and blah, blah, blah. And anyway, so about a week before we actually go into the school hall we got the set was going in, and, all the lights and everything, and the rehearsals were going on. I get a call from Dick Copland, the head teacher, saying, Malcolm, there's a call for you from New York. I was like, what? Can you come to the office? So I came to the office, and I said, who is it? And he said, I don't know. Just somebody wanted to speak to you. So he passes me the phone, and there's this guy on the phone. He goes, hi, Malcolm, I've been reading about your show, Stardust, the school version, in the New York Times. I was like, what? This is mad. And he said, I wondered if I could fly over with the writer and see the last night. But I know the tickets are all sold out. So we're happy just to sit, at the back or whatever. I was like, yeah, of course. And I said, do you mind me asking who you are? And he said, oh, yeah, I'm sorry. He said, I'm David Puttnam, the director of Stardust, who, of course, is now Lord Puttnam and Chariots of Fire. And I mean, one of the greatest English directors of all time. And so David and Ray rocked up for that last night, watched the show, and it blew them away. And we ended up after the show, because it really went down well. We had, I think it was 3 or 4 standing ovations from the audience. It's crazy. The real sense of euphoria, and the kids were brilliant. I mean, they were just, we had 3 girls doing the Ronettes, Madam on something, and they were. If you listen to them, and I've got the tape, they sound as good, if not a bit better than the Ronettes. They're really great, kind of slightly Geordie Mackham version of it, But anyway, we end up on this beach because where Riot was right on the coast, and a lot of the collieries used to dump the bad coal, the slag as it was called, in the North Sea. So, this is before, green energy and all of that. They just dump it in the sea, and then it would wash back up on the beaches. So all the beaches in the Northeast were black, most of them anyway, around County Durham, where I lived. They were black sand, like Lanzarote or, Hawaii, and only not like Hawaii at all. And we end up with David and Ray and some of the 6th formers, on the beach at like 1 o'clock in the morning. There was the odd bottle of Newcastle brown ale floating around, I remember. And David and Ray said, Malcolm, can we have a word with you? And I said, yeah. I said, look, you've got to resign. I said, excuse me? You've got to resign. You've got to stop. You've got to do this. You've got to do what we saw tonight. That's your destiny. That's what you've got to do. And David and I will help you, to do that. This is Ray talking. And then David said, you must get out, because if you don't get out, you're going to be one of those who wears a tweed jacket and a leather arm patch in 20 years. And he said, that's not good. Just get out. You'll be fine. And I said, but I've got a pension and I don't know what else would I do? Don't worry about it, Malcolm. It'll be fine. But the only way you're going to do it is if you get out. If you stay there, it's comfortable. I'm sure you're going to get a promotion after all of this success. which I did. I got asked to head up the sixth form, and they said, just get out and we'll get you in somewhere.
Before you go to where he got you in, I just want to connect to something, because I think this is also fascinating. Britain, particularly in that era, was so centralized on London. The North didn't matter at all. It was all came from London, and London was the focus, particularly for media. Now, there you are with Stardust, and you're writing new lines, aren't you, for this performance? How important was that for the children to be able to identify themselves in something that they probably couldn't identify themselves with anything they were watching on television? More with Malcolm coming up. Just time for me to remind you to please subscribe. It really helps me, and it allows you to find out when I've posted a new interview on the site. Okay, let's get back to Malcolm. How important was that for the children to be able to identify themselves in something that they probably couldn't identify themselves with anything they were watching on television?
I think it was, I mean, you make a really good point, Steve. It was vital, absolutely vital. And I think, partly because of the environment that Dick had created at the school, there was everybody wanted this to work. Even the old guard, who'd been really against us doing Tommy, really wouldn't have anything to do with it, and bad mouthed it everywhere they could. Even like the woodwork teacher, I remember, who was he'd be a kind of Farage type character, got involved in making the set, and you went in there. I remember walking in, and he had the whole class making, like in case of, different parts of, like, the fairground scene in Stardust. They'd have like a classic fairground, roundabout going on. They were all beavering away, and he was like, he was kind of moved, it's taking up a lot of time, but he was doing it, and I could tell he was loving doing it. And sure enough, he asked for 6 tickets for the show. So I think, it was vital that they felt engaged, not in something which had already been done, but something that was also being adapted, so that they were adding their stamp on their version of Stardust. It was bespoke. It was bespoke. And we felt that as well. And it flattered David and Ray, that fact that, the kids had added to Ray's script and added to David's visual interpretation of that storyline, that narrative.
So where did David take you to? What did he actually then, where did he push you?
So it was interesting. But to your point about North versus South, it was, and I mean, it's still, I have to say, sadly, there's still a big chunk of this. It's like 2 different countries, London and the Northeast, particularly the Northeast at that time, because eventually there was a couple of opportunities which David threw my way, and Ray. One was at LWT. I couldn't move down to London because there was sickness in the family. Stopped me, and to be honest, I didn't have the funds to do that, and it was too much to think about. Children on the way, etc., etc., and it just didn't work. So one day I get a call from David saying, it was David or Ray, I can't remember now. I think it might have been David. Anyway, one of them said, "We've heard about this woman at Tyne Television," which was the local regional TV station in Newcastle. And this is before Janice Street Porter was invented, and she's obsessed about making programmers for young people. And I think you should go and see her, because I'm hearing great things about it. So, get in touch with her, Malcolm. We can give you the details. Send her all your press cuttings for Tommy and Stardust, and just keep on a case, keep on a case, keep on a case. And we're going to put a word in as well. I was like, wow. So anyway, I did that, sent her all my cuttings, didn't hear anything, sent some more. And then I think one of David or Ray had made a phone call. And I finally get this call saying, "Okay, let's meet up for a drink." And the thing is, Steve, to your point, Tyne Television was a regional TV station, which meant that they rarely got any of their programs on the network, because the big TV stations, it was like a cartel. London Weekend Television, Granada TV, Thames TV. They were the big ITV studios, which basically controlled all the primetime slots and then de facto all of the prime advertising revenue. So the last thing they wanted was Tyne TV or Border TV, taking a chunk out of their revenue. So trying to break into a network show was difficult. So a lot of great, fantastic documentaries and other programs never got on the network that were made from these regional TV stations. So anyway, I met up with Andrea, cut a long story short, and she said, look, there's a real problem here, Malcolm. To get into TV, it's different now, but then to get into TV, you need to have a union card. The only way you get a union card is if you work in TV. So it was what was called a closed shop. And I said, oh, well, that's me dead in the water, then, isn't it? She said, no, we can get you in as a trainee, but it'll be a very short contract, like 6 weeks, 8 weeks. But at least it gets your foot in the door. And you'll have to work on any show they throw at you. Doesn't matter what it is, gardening, food, pets, astrology, whatever. Just don't worry about it. Just get in there. And she said, I'll help oil the wheels. So I get an interview, and I get in for 6 weeks. And I was like, God, how are we going to survive? How am I going to pay the rent? And then I opened the offer letter outside on the steps of Tyne. And for that 6 weeks, it was like 4 months' salary as a teacher. It was just so much more money. And I was like, wow, and we'll pay your expenses. What? We'll pay my petrol. And I was like, wow, I like this, And I did that, and it was a show called Miss Tyne TV, which was like the Geordie version of Miss World. And my job was to go and check out all the nightclubs. They thought I'd be good at this because I knew all the nightclubs in the region, Annabelle's and all Fiesta at Stockton. And my job was to go and make sure that the stage was level so that the girls wouldn't break their ankle wearing their high heel shoes. So if there was any hole in the stage, the club proprietor had to fill the holes in, and that the tampon machines in the dressing rooms were working. It's like, welcome to showbiz, Malcolm.
Oh, that's brilliant. I mean, there was okay, so there was this short period, and I'm just going to cut the story a little bit, because at one point Channel 4 came along, and
Yes.
they wanted a format, and you developed a format. Tell me about that format. What was it called, and how did it differ to what was eventually to come?
Yeah, so we'd been making a regional TV show, only shown in the Northeast and one or two of the regional companies, called All Right Now. And All Right Now, I wanted to recreate the sense of a live gig in a studio. No miming, no tapes, nothing. The bands play what they want. They've got total freedom, and they plug in and they play in front of a live audience, and then they get out and they go to the pub. And we did this, and the word got around that this was like a cool show. So we had the Jam and Elvis Costello and the Clash, office rang me and said, the boys want to do it. And that was a real coup, because they only ever did 2 televisions in their whole career. One was for Right Now, and one was in Manchester for a show called Something Else, I think, run by Mike Boland, who we'll come back to in a minute. Anyway, so Andrea got me in one day, my boss, and said, Malcolm, we can't get these shows on the network. There's a new network coming along. At the time, Steve, there was only 3 networks: BBC One, BBC Two, ITV. That was it. Now there are hundreds and hundreds of channels. But there's a new channel coming on called Channel 4, run by a guy called Jeremy Isaacs, and he wants all the shows to be networked. Doesn't matter what it is, where it is from, doesn't give a damn. They're all going to be networked. We've got to do something. So let's work up an idea. So we came up with an idea called Jamming. It was for 6 or 8 half hours, based on All Right Now, essentially. And we sent it off. I then had to go to Sweden because we were doing a kids show called Razzmatazz, which was networked. They were happy to let us have children's programs on the network, but not the big primetime ones. And I was waiting to do this interview for ABBA, and when I was in the bar with the camera crew in Stockholm, and I got a call from Andrea saying, Malcolm, do you want the bad news or the good news? We've heard back from Channel 4. And I said, oh, God. I said, give me the bad news first. She said, well, sadly, they've passed on jamming. However, they do want a music show, but they want it to start the first week the channel goes on air, November the 5th, 1982. And they want 25 live to air, 1 hour, 45-minute shows every Friday night. The weekend begins here. And the budget is X, which was like huge. And she said, you've got to come back tonight. You've got to come back tonight because Jeremy Isaacs wants to meet you in Charlotte Street. He wants to meet you before he actually, presses the green button. I was like, oh, God, this is crazy. Go back. We go to this restaurant in Charlotte Street. In comes Jeremy, a kind of wave of hair and a big black coat, remember? And I'd been working out, what am I going to say, what the format should be, who's going to present it, blah, 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 blah. And he was really late, really late for the lunch, like an hour and 15 minutes late. And he came in and said, you're Malcolm. Yeah, this is great. I'm going to do this show from Newcastle. And you can get all the big names. Yeah, I said, yeah, we'll get the big names. Thinking, we had for All Right Now, so I knew we'd get them for for this new show. And he said, look, I've only got, he said, what's the title? I said, The Tube. Yeah, okay, The Tube. He said, okay. I said, do you want me to talk you through? No, I haven't got time. He said, look, I've only got two things to say to you, Malcolm. Make it live and give it balls. Gotta go, bye.
Make it live, give it balls. What date was that he said that, when you're going to run up to November and there you are, you've got to do this series and build a team, everything?
That must have been, God, it's a good question, Steve. And I might get this horribly wrong because I haven't researched it and my memory is rubbish. It was probably end of 81. Yeah. Because, end of 81 or early 82. We had enough time to get our shit together, to be fair. And in fact, we ended up shooting a relatively new band called Queen in Milton Keynes, just because I'd heard this album and I thought, my God, this is going to be enormous, epic. We've got to get something in the can and we can drop this into the series. And I persuaded the channel or Andrea persuaded the channel to release some money so we could shoot this new band called Queen in Milton. Well, they weren't that new. They'd had the album out. But Milton Keynes Bowl it was. Anyway, so that was the birth of, and instead of running for 6 weeks, it ran for 6 years, sold all over the world, and we got every major artist on the planet to make the journey to Newcastle.
I mean, what's really fascinates me is in that period of building up, you've got to build up a team. What do you remember about your vision that you transported to people, and what type of people did you have in your mind that you actually wanted? Because you've talked about being anarchic, doing things. You've talked about the school, which is really taking risks, but working in a team environment and being supportive. So there's lots of elements in your previous life, as it were, that you're bringing towards the Tube. So I wonder what criteria you set out for people that worked with you.
No, it's a great question. I mean, some of the team who'd worked on All Right Now, the regional music show before the Tube, obviously were perfectly suited, but there were a tiny team. There was only really a couple of them. I guess not by design, but then nothing I've done really is by design. The team ended up being totally dysfunctional. I mean, if ever there was a bunch of mavericks, it was really like something from the Wild West. Because there was a complete mix of very, very straight people, Oxbridge people who'd never made a program before in their lives or had only done a bit of local radio, a complete mixed journalist, an out-and-out feminist, and one of the guys who ultimately went on to be executive producer at Top of the Pops. One of the lads who I used to teach and was in Stardust.
Was that
my
Chris?
Class, a guy called Chris Cowie.
Yeah.
And he became, one of the assistant producers, and then one of the producers on the show. And that was a lovely feeling to see somebody like Chris come through. I mean, there's a lot of people came through from Riot School, including, from my drama group, didn't go to school, but the drama group attached, Gina McKee, great actress. And anyway, so I think and then the guy who was like the operational producer in the middle of it all was a guy called Paul McCartney, who was a brilliant journalist and came from news, not from music. And he had a big beard like ZZ Top, great big beard, and he got thrown into this kind of cauldron of, crazy people. And it was a great time for music as well at that time. So it was all these dysfunctional people. But the one thing that they all had in common was they were passionate about music, absolutely passionate about it. And Chris Phipps, who was became one of the legends of the Tube team. When we met him, he was a real out and out brummie, and he's knocked around with the Black Sabbath boys and everything. He is two passions. I remember in his interview, I said, "What type of music do you like?" And he said, "Heavy metal, death metal, and reggae." I thought, "You've got the job."
Oh, brilliant. I remember watching it because it was something that you had to watch as, well, I was in my 20s in the era when it was on, and you actually had to watch it, but it was like performances that you never saw before. You broke bands. Secondly, it had this anarchic thing that you never knew what was really going to happen during the show. Thirdly, it had presenters that no one had ever really seen before. It challenged the whole idea of presentation. They would ask something so like off the wall, and so crazy, and do so many crazy things. And another thing were the features where you would go to places and report on some of it. One that I remember really well was that you went to East Berlin to find the music scene pre-wall coming down, obviously, and found a band called Jessica. I remember that in East Berlin. But you did things which were so unusual and so new. How aware were you that you were breaking the mold in every area?
I mean, at the time, it wasn't a conscious thing to break the mold. The reason I wanted to get into music television is because I was passionate about music and passionate about TV, and you put the two together, and that gives you a huge opportunity to create all sorts of different things. And at that particular time, these new channels coming on board, and of course the biggest new channel that came on board was a channel called MTV, which was wall-to-wall music videos, and that encouraged huge creativity, not from the channel necessarily, but from the producers of those videos. So suddenly music video became an art form in its own sense. So and I was watching what was on traditional television on the TV we had. It was the Old Grey Whistle Test and Top of the Pops. And both of them by this time it was like watching wood warp. It was so dull and boring. And I mean, even at the height of punk, the Whistle Test would still be focusing on the West Coast soft rock, like the Eagles. And I was like, what? This is mad. You've got a revolution going on in music on your doorstep and you're ignoring it. And Top of the Pops was obviously chart based and it just felt old and cobwebby. So when Channel 4 came along and MTV came along and a groundbreaking, fantastic magazine, which we kind of aligned ourselves with, and they with us, called The Face. And The Face messed around with graphics and had, interviews upside down, not for the sake of it, just because visually it was stunning. It was powerful, and that you don't have to do a magazine like, the way that people had done magazines up until then. And I think we were encouraged by Channel 4 and Mike Boland in particular, who was the commissioning editor, brilliant man, who basically encouraged us to try different things. Let's just see, how can you do this in a fresh way and not just put a band on with a presenter, who's usually a DJ or a journalist, introducing them. How can you do it in a different way and make it more entertaining? And that's why, as well as new bands, big bands, features, Lee Scratch Perry in his studio in Jamaica, with a spliff the size of a football pitch in his mouth. There's one scene in particular, I remember when we got it back, a whole scene, half the interview that Jules did with Lee Scratch, you couldn't see a thing because it was just blue smoke. There was nothing. It was like, you might as well just got shot a room full of smoke and said you were in Jamaica and did an audio interview, But I think, so we weren't setting out deliberately just to mess things up. It just came from partly because it was live to air. And that got us into so much trouble later on that there was no time delay. So if anything happened, as it did regularly, or anybody said something which perhaps they shouldn't have done while people were having their egg and chips, then it was out. It was on the air. It was live. And so there was a sense of kind of built in, kind of, oh my God, what's going to happen? Because once we were on air, that was it. There was no stopping. There was no starting. You were there. And you put in some of the most, iconic music artists in the world in one room, playing live to a live audience, and a whole bunch of what were then called alternate comedians, the Dangerous Brothers, Rick Mayall, and his sidekick, Ade Edmondson, French and Saunders, who were this new female double act coming through, Robbie Coltrane, Stephen Fry, Vic Reeves, first ever television on the Tube, from local lad from Teesside. You would never have believed, put that cocktail together and guess what? Sparks are going to fly. And then we had what were called at the time, it sounds awful now, activist poets like Mark My Words and John Cooper Clarke, and an amazing radical, I don't know what you'd call him, performance poet musician called Fofo Spearjig, or Waver So Shave, as his recording name was, who had invented this character called the Hard. I'm the Hard. I'm a Geordie Hard. I felt out, and he'd bash himself on the head with a hammer. Felt out. Drank 20 bottles of Newcastle brown ale last night. Felt out.
More of Malcolm coming up. Don't go away. Please subscribe. Really helps me. Okay, let's get back to Malcolm. You mentioned earlier that some of the staff, most sort of a diverse staff, but some of the staff were Oxford and Cambridge University. Yep. One thing that I face...
Only two of them.
Okay, but one thing that I face being down south and wanting to get into television was that in a way, it was just as difficult, because if you didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge, the BBC wouldn't really look at you. You weren't considered in any way, and that was a battle. And I remember seeing the Tube and being inspired one day to do this mad thing, which is I got a coach to Newcastle, went up to the door, and this lovely woman who was at the door on your show, because it was this where the studio was, I said to her, "Oh, I want to see Malcolm Gerrie," and she said to me, "Have you got an appointment, love?" In a Newcastle accent, and I said, "No." She went, "Where have you come from?" And I went, "London." And she said, "I can't believe it. Hang on, I'll give him a call." And she gave you a call, and you invited me in. And yep. Today, it seems like it's an insanity what I did, but it isn't. It's something that takes you to another stage. And I remember you said to me, because you said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "I want to present the show." It's so madness. So I want to present the show. And you said to me, "Well, hang on a minute. Well, what could we think about that later? But what could we do now?" And then came up with an idea that the audience could be more cosmopolitan and said, why don't you, bring up a more cosmopolitan audience from London for the live show? So then for the next few weeks, I found this, I think it was a gay black club. I was really popular, Malcolm. Thank you so much. So I went to this gay black club and then had to entice everyone to get on a bus at 5 o'clock in the morning to go up for this show. And it was hysterical because I would bring up, at that point, so there'd be some trans people. So I'd bring up these, trans people as well to be in the audience. And, obviously it changed the fabric of the audience in some way. But what I loved about it is that you appreciated my drive and combined with the innocence.
Yeah. And I think that's what I learned from Andrea. So, I mean, you kind of pass it down, and I'd learned from Dick Copland, the head of Riot School. And I think that you asked me before, Steve, about, were there any lessons I learned from being a teacher? Yes. But if I hadn't been in that type of school, if I'd been in a traditional grammar school teaching, metaphors and similes and Chaucer, I wouldn't have had that experience, and I wouldn't have been able to, pass on those skills that I was able to, which I got from Dick and then from Andrea and to Mike Boland from some extent to, if I'd go to him with an idea and say, look, do you think we want to go to Jamaica and do a whole thing about, the shootings in Kingston? Is this too heavy for, tea time on Channel 4? And he was said, well, no, but he said, why, instead of just focusing on the shootings in Jamaica, why don't you get what Lee Scratch Perry thinks about it? What is, what do some of the Wailers think about it? Get one of the guys from the Scatterlight, and so you combine politics and music, and that was a real lesson. But I remember that you coming in, Steve, and I met that those coaches became infamous, those coach trips. And but what was great about them, and where you were spot on the money, and it was, I'm so pleased you did that, is on the Tube team, the original Tube team, we had 1, 2, 3, 4 gay people on the Tube team, researchers, producers. And at that time in Newcastle, in 1981, 82, it wasn't like being in Soho or it was difficult for some of those guys. And there was one club opened up later called Rock Shots, which was a gay club in Newcastle, and we filmed there actually. And I think you mentioned the word diverse, and it's a word that's been abused, heavily and used by, certain right-wing people, like the word woke is kind of associated in that kind of bag. And I hate all that, nonsense. And I was brought up that you judge a person by, by them, by their personality and what they do, not by the color of their skin or what their sexual preferences are. So just bollocks, what's that got to do with anything? And I think that the Tube became as big and as successful as it was because of that team, absolutely, and given the freedom that Channel 4 gave us to push the envelope and do new things. But it was the team who had to deliver it, and for all the fun we had, and it was an amazing kind of bubble that we lived in for those 5-6 years. They've worked their socks off, and it sounds sort of glamorous going to Jamaica, taking Culture Club to Japan and walking on stage with Boy George. I remember he wore a wedding dress, and as he went onto the stage, he picked up his veil and just kissed the camera lens, at the Budokan. We actually touched on things like, sexuality in the show. And of course, with the presenters, with Paula, who was fearless, absolutely fearless, she would get stuck into any issue or talk about anything she wanted to, regardless of what we had in the running order. If she wanted to talk to somebody about it, she would, about a subject. And Jules, similarly, those the chemistry between those two people and the new presenters that we had on screen is also what made it what it was.
How free were those performances, and could people do practically anything they wanted?
How free were they? They had almost complete freedom. I say almost because we would always say to them, so if Paul Weller or anybody just said, Malcolm, yeah, we'll do the show, as long as it performed live, so no miming or backing tapes, that was like rule number one. They also had to come up on the Thursday because we treat the whole thing like a gig, but it was a gig with 4 or 5 acts. So they had to do a proper sound check because the sound on the other 2 TV shows, well, the Top of the Pops was all mimed, but the sound on the whistle test, often wasn't great, really not. And so one of the things that we just had to get right, we had to get it right if this was going to succeed. And you wanted people like Prince or Elton to perform, or U2, which they all did, then you had to get the sound right because it's a music show. And so they had to come up on the Thursday and stay over. So it was quite a commitment. It was a 2-day commitment out of their busy promotional, and expensive, So that was crucial. But if they said to us or to one of the Chris or Jeff Brown or the bookers that, well, we just want to do 3 new songs or 2 new songs, they could do that. But what we'd always say to them is, look, if you can do a song, whether it's a cover version of something, a song that you guys adore, or it's a song that one of your previous hits, it's going to pull more people in to watch the new song than it would if you just do 2 new songs, because you run the risk of just people switching over. And most of them anyway wanted to do, I'd say 95% of the time wanted to do a hit, which was from a single, and then a new track or a track off the album that they had out. But if anybody wanted to do just new songs, they could, and that freedom was essential. I remember talking to the Clash boys when they came up for All Right Now, and I said, "Well, I'm honoured, guys. Why would you do this?" And they said, because our manager, Caroline, what's she called, Caroline Kuhn, had said, "Oh, by the way, on this show, All Right Now, you can do whatever you want, just whatever you want. If you don't want to do an interview, you don't need to do an interview." But they did, and whatever songs you want to do, you just want to do cover versions, you can do cover. So that freedom was really, really important. But as I say, it never became an issue, because most of the acts wanted to do, what Eurythmics would do, Sweet Dreams, because at the time it was it was about to burst into one of the classic songs of all time. But then they'd play another song, which was a new song. But letting the artists know that they had that freedom, I think, was back to what we were saying about being a teacher. It helped garner the trust between us and them, because music, you'd think music and TV would be natural bedfellows. They're not, not because of the artistic qualities of those genres, but because of the people who are around them. TV people, especially back in the day, and it's going back to the way it was, unfortunately, now, and people around music artists, record companies, and managers and agents, often, especially promoters, because they saw television as taking money away from their gigs, often were at odds with each other. So to give people freedom, I think, was a great way to garner trust.
The other thing that really sort of touched me when I watched that show is, like, looking back, you see artists that were given their first chance of national television in Britain, and you met a young Madonna who the record company in Britain really didn't give a shit about.
Yeah. I'd met her in New York. We were doing some filming in New York with David Byrne. And David and I kind of hit the ground running. For some reason, we just got on really well. I thought, well, he's a really lovely man and brilliant, and had drinks in his apartment. And then he said, "Oh, what are you doing tonight?" And I said, "Nothing. We don't start filming. The next filming day is tomorrow. We're finished now." He said, "Oh, great." And he said, "Do you want to come to this little club?" And I said, "Yeah, I'd love to. I've got to go to a club in New York with David Byrne." And I said, "Where are we going?" He said, "Oh, you probably haven't heard of it. It's called the Knitting Factory. It's a little jazz club, tiny." And there was some famous sax player or trumpet player on now. I can't remember who it was. And anyway, we went there. It was like really cool place. I mean, like really, you talk about being in with the in crowd. It was like, wow, you know, and he was relaxed there because there was lots of other artists, you know, recognized faces there and from different bands. And anyway, it was red hot. It was in the middle of the summer. It was red hot. There was no aircon. And it was people had to go out, you know, and it was full of smoke, of course. And so he said, "Oh, should we go and have a cold beer outside and just sit on the road?" I said, "Yeah." We sat on the curb outside of the knitting factory, and I spotted this girl. She must have only been like 17. With, I mean, she just looked extraordinary, and she, of all the extraordinary things she had a massive crucifix on her chest, but with Christ on the crucifix. You know, it wasn't just a cross. And I was like, what Christ? You know, look at her, and her hair was like, you know. And he said, "Oh yeah." He said, she's going to be huge." I said, "Oh, what's she called?" And he said, "Madonna." And I said, "You're kidding me." And I said, "No, no, no." He said, "No." He said, "She's going to be huge. She's so cool." And you know, "Do you want to meet her?" And I said, "No, no, no, I don't want to." She looks scary. And he said, "No, come on." So we went over and I said hi, and she said hi, you know, and like, and that was it. And then we went back in the club. That was the extent of the conversation. It was like 3 or 4 words we exchanged. And David spoke to her more than I did, and went back in. Anyway, wind the clock forward. And at one of the kind of like the meetings that we had about, you know, who we were going to book for the show, her name came up because it'd been an article in the Face magazine. This is how we worked kind of in tandem. And I said, "Oh, I met her when I was over when we were in Manhattan doing the David Byrne thing." And the team were like, "Really?" But she's like the hottest new thing, Malcolm. We've got to book her. We've got to book her. And I said, "Yeah." I said, "I don't think she's got a record label." Anyway, Chris Phipps or Chris Carrier or Jeff Brown, one of the guys said, "No, no, she's being signed by Warner's." I said, "Oh, great." You know, I know, and you know, we know the team at Warner's. I ring up Warner's, the head board at Warner's, and I said, we were doing this big special live from the Hacienda Club in Manchester, because we used to move the tube around, and you know, with Tony Wilson, and we need a really great kind of cool as hell, you know, club act for the Hacienda. And I think Madonna would fit the bill because that's where I first saw her. Even though she wasn't performing, she was at this club with them. And he said, "What? So what are you asking me for, Malcolm?" I said, "Well, would you, you know, are you happy for us to book her, and would you help towards, which all the record companies did back then, help with the expenses to get her up to?" And he said, "No, I won't." And I was like, "What?" And I knew she's brand new act. No one's really heard of her. And I said, "Why? Why? Honestly?" And he said, "No." He said, "She's an American signing, and she's got dancers with her, and she needs hair and makeup. That's no." And she said, "Look," and I said, "Please," I said, "You know, we'll put up, you know, some of the money as well." But I said, "You know, she's perfect. Tony's excited that some of the booking team at the Hacienda have already been trying to get her anyway to play at the club. So this is a win-win for everybody. Win-win for Warner's, a win for the Hacienda and Tony, a win for the Tube." And he said, "No." He said, "Listen, Malcolm, stop. She is a no priority act. Listen to me. Watch the lips. I'm not going to help you. It's up to you. If you want to book her, speak to the US. Bang, down with the phone." So I thought, right. So we found out some agent that was looking after her at the time. She didn't really have a manager or anything. And we did a deal where we would pay for her to come up to London, and we would keep all the rights to that performance in return. So Tyne Tees ended up owning, you know, the first TV appearance of Madonna in the UK ever. And she sang live, and you know, it was and then of course she went on to be the biggest act on the planet, and it was like great. And that was typical of, you know, Frankie Goes to Hollywood was another one. You know, no one had ever heard of Frankie Goes to Hollywood. They didn't have a record deal. They weren't even, you know, there wasn't much press about them at the time. And we shot them, you know, in Liverpool as one of the, we used to go around the different cities, if you remember, Steve, and we did a little special on Hull, with a young band, again, just formed, called the House Martins, with a very young Norman Cook in there, Fatboy Slim. And yeah, so most of the cities that we did, you know, had acts in there that then went on to become big, if not mega. And
didn't you do the S&M Club video for Frankie as well?
Yeah,
yeah, because you know the girl behind the bar with the long blonde hair.
Yes.
Yeah, I used to go to nightclubs with her aunt and Angela. So she was from Liverpool. So she became, you know, sort of famous because of that appearance. But that video was, I mean, that was out there for that period in time. That was an absolute seen as being absolutely outrageous by, you know, the general population, and it was the thing that made them.
Yeah, I mean, we got slaughtered in the Sun, and the Red Tops just ripped us apart after that went out. I mean, you know, and there was people on radio saying the tube's got to be taken off the air, you know, Channel 4, Channel swore, you know, Channel yawn, all this real backlash. But you know, we mentioned how great the sound was on the show, and you mentioned the direction on that. We were blessed, absolutely blessed, by having two directors, one who'd been doing, you know, news and a little bit of entertainment, and the other one who'd been doing inserts into the BBC news program, Jeff Wanfor and Gavin Taylor, who again became two of the greatest music TV directors, not just in the UK but in the world, you know. And that Frankie video was Jeff Wanfor at his best, and he broke all the rules. He rang me up and he said, "Mark," he said, "I just want to tip you off before we go in here." He said, "The band, you know, the band are quite." I said, "I know all about the band, Jeff. Don't worry." And he said, "Yeah, but the venue is like, you know, there's butt plugs lying around and gimp masks in the cupboard." I said, "Yeah, and your point is?" He said, "Well, I'm just telling you, that's all. Are you happy?" I said, "I'm thrilled, actually. It sounds great, kid. Go for it." And I said, "Have some fun. Get the, you know," and Jeff had this thing, he would never have the camera on legs. Got rid of that. So beforehand, all the handheld stuff, which you saw later, and Chris Evans has been very gracious to credit Jeff with this and the tube. You know, there was no static shots. Even on interviews, it was handheld, walking around, side shots before that was trendy. And that video, you know, it was gloves off. It was absolute, you know, we're going to go for it. And the band were just extraordinary. And that it went out on the Friday. On the Saturday night, I was at home in Peterlee. The phone rang, and it was Trevor Horn. And he said, "Malcolm, that band you had on last night, it's just extraordinary. That song, that voice. Have you got a contact? I want to get in touch with them. I've never seen anything like this for years." And that was Trevor Horn, you know, one of the greatest music producers this country's ever produced. And I said, "Yeah, I'll give you the number." And of course, the rest was history. And because then the BBC banned the record, you know, because of the famous line, you know, "When you want to come, when you want to come," and it just helped us. I mean, we got massive press out of it. Kid Jensen banned the record. BBC Radio banned the record. The record went to #1, I think, or certainly #2. And so what we did is the week that we knew it was going to go to #1, we invited them back to perform in the studio. And again, it was, "Look, guys, wear what you want, do what you want," you know. And they did you can see it on YouTube. They absolutely smashed it with a live version of Relax, you know.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. I mean, you mentioned that you know, the sort of, it almost could have been the end. People wanted the tube to end at that point. The tube ended, of course, at some point, and it ended with a 3-day party, I hear.
It did. You know, we had this. Now my memory is very vague about this. We did
Well,
have
I'm not
this
surprised.
extraordinary nightclub. I mean, it's fantastic. You know, Newcastle's a party city. You know, it always has been. You know, it's like a bit like like Liverpool and Sheffield. It's, you know, and there was this huge boat in the middle of the River Tyne on the Gateshead side, on the south side, because Newcastle wouldn't allow it, called the Tuxedo Princess. And it was a floating nightclub in this huge boat. And and so essentially we decided to that because the city, Newcastle you could not have done that show anywhere else but in Newcastle, because Newcastle had and still has an energy about it, and kind of provides the canvas and the freedom to do what we did. And people were hungry to make it work. They really wanted to make it work. And I think, because there's so much production in London and now in Manchester, there's people down here, and I've lived down here a long time now. There's more of a complacent attitude to it. That, at this point, getting a big network show, 25 weeks of the year, live, an hour and a half, which became an hour and a half because an hour and 45 minutes was a weird time slot, was just such a huge thing. And, everybody embraced it. The cafes, the bars, the clubs, the taxi drivers. When the Tube finished, the local cab firm laid off 200 drivers. That's because all those drivers were taking people to hotels, to nightclubs, to restaurants, driving them to other gigs that they had they do in the region. Press people, managers, agents, record companies. It was like a whole industry created around the show. And the party, the party was legendary. I mean, seriously, I remember getting a call from the police on the, I think it was on the Sunday morning or the Monday morning. I can't remember now. The show went out on obviously on the Friday, saying, Malcolm, there's a whole, I think that your audience are lying down by the river under what is like a power station, and we're a bit worried because they're smoking. They're all smokers, and they're smoking what my father used to call jazz cigarettes. And the policeman was so polite, and he said, we're a bit worried because there's about 500 gallons of petrol underneath, above where they've got their, where they're spending the night. So I had to go down and persuade them to leave, that this wasn't a good idea to sleep. They had to go home, guys. The party's over, And they were like, "Oh, it was a great show. It was a great show. But were we on the telly? Were we on the telly?" And one of them was like, "Yeah, my mom rang me and she said I was on the telly."
That is so brilliant.
The whole city was taken over that Friday night. I mean, you couldn't have gone to any bar or nightclub that wasn't, bittersweet. Very sad about the show ending, but also it was just a massive celebration, and that's what we wanted to do. Go out with a bang. I
mean, that must have left a hole in your life afterwards that you had to deal with. I know that, you went on, I think, first of all, to do the BRIT Awards, and then, of course, initial television, which was a massive success. But was it difficult to deal with that initial period afterwards?
Yeah, it was. It was like, it was a loss, it was like a kind of death in a funny way without sounding too dramatic, but it really was. Although we continued to do lots of big, especially Gavin and Jeff had become known as these really hot directors. And so we did things like, the Queen concert at Wembley Stadium, the famous one where Freddie wore the crown and everything. And we shot, famously, this was during the Tube, we'd shot the Band-Aid video, the original one, Do They Know It's Christmas? And that, Jeff built up a relationship with some of the artists from there. So we were doing lots of specials. Island 25, which was its 25th anniversary of Island Records, we did at Pinewood Studios with all of the Island roster. There was still audience there a week later. And Michael Grade, who was running the place, rang me up and said, "Malcolm, you've got to come down and get rid of these kids. They won't go away." So there was huge specials. It was, I tell you what broke the spell was Channel 4 again. This is when the channel used to do these sort of things. A new commissioning editor called Valdemar Januszczyk, who's now the Sunday Times art critic, rang me and said, "Malcolm, I want to do a music show. Come up with an idea, come up with a format, but I want it to be very different." And we came up with this idea called The White Room. And that broke the spell, because The White Room, I'm as proud of The White Room, almost as proud of The White Room, if not as proud as I was of the Tube, because on The White Room, we shot it just down the road here, and it was just a white room. literally what it was. Mark my words, and Joe. And if you look back at those artists, it's all up on YouTube. You know, Prince, Stevie Wonder, Lou Reed, you know, The Jam, Oasis, you know, style counselors. What was it then? Oasis were like the house band. The Oasis boys used to come along and just hang out, even when they weren't on the show, to see, you know, to see Ray Davis, or, you know, and then we did all these duets, which is something I'd kind of pioneered with the Brits, getting unlikely people together like PJ Harvey and Bjork, or Tom Jones and Robbie Williams, Jamiroquai and Diana Ross. And we did that. We repeated that on the White Room.
Jarvis Cocker and Michael Jackson. I was there.
That was the most famous one.
Not quite a duet, but, you know.
Yeah, that caused a stir. It was the front page of every newspaper in the world.
That was amazing when he went up on. I mean, it was such a shock to see that him going up on stage, and it was just brilliant. It was one of those moments that, you know, that when you're there and you see something like that, it's one of those sort of historic music moments.
Yeah. And Michael Jackson the next morning came to the edit suite at 6 o'clock in the morning, insisting on seeing the footage. 6 o'clock in the morning with Paul Berger, the chairman of Sony Records, and David Mallet was the director, and he came to the edit suite in Charlotte Street, and I met him, and we went into the edit suite, and he said, "I only want you and David and the other producer, a guy called Andy Ward, who was brilliant." And we locked the door, and the first thing that Michael did was go over to all the, you know, the funny microphones you have in studios, like bendy microphones. He screwed the ends of all of the microphones and had them in his hand, so nobody could listen to our conversation.
Wow.
And he was lovely. He was fine, and he wasn't that bothered about it. He was more worried about the light, because David Mallet's signature was to blast white light from behind. You'd probably seen on Queen and Bowie. He did all the Bowie videos. You know, his signature was to just blast this white light, which got this wonderful effect. You never knew quite what it was going to do with the lens and the video. And he was worried about that, because it kind of, you know, he'd had a bit of work done to his face, and it didn't, a couple of the shots didn't look great. So we kind of did a deal with Michael that, yeah, we can correct that, you know, don't worry. And he was very gracious. He's much bigger than I thought he was. And off he went afterwards and shook my hand, and, you know, he's very soft spoken, and, you know, I said, "Malcolm, I'll remember you for this, and thank you so much. And I've got to go now, but thank you, and God, you know, God bless." And off he went. And it was like, did that just happen?
That is so brilliant.
And we had to bail Jarvis Cocker. Mark Moreau, who was the head of Island Records, because Jarvis was signed to Island, had to take Bob Mortimer, because Bob Mortimer used to be a solicitor lawyer. Mark and Bob went to Brixton to bail Jarvis out of jail.
Oh, that is incredible. What a story. What a story. You mentioned, you know, right, this is sort of early on in the interview, you were talking about Talks music. And I used to absolutely love the Actors Studio. I think I've watched every single episode. And it was the guy who was behind that who had come up with this idea, which was, you know, instead of film directors, actors and so on, it's musicians, and you're doing the interviews. How did you decide to approach those interviews to make them your style and different from other interviews that had happened before? Because they were massive records, weren't they? There were some records that were like 4 hours long or something.
That's right. Yeah. Well, ironically, I mean, that I'd been a huge fan of the Actors Studio for a long time, which, if anybody hasn't seen it, was this kind of very academic, quite arch format, where I can't remember the name of the guy now, my goodness, whoever the presenter was absolutely soaked in knowledge about whichever actor he was interviewing in front of an audience of students who then had an opportunity to do a Q&A. And I'd approached the director of that show and said, lovely man, and said, why don't we do this with music? Because I think I could sell that to a relatively new channel at the time, well, newish, called Sky Arts, run by a wonderful man called Phil Edgar Jones. And I'd spoken to the commissioning editor, Barbara, about this, and she said, oh, well, as long as you could get the big names, Malcolm, I think, you know, we'd be interested, but you'd have to get a good host. And anyway, we interviewed all sorts of people, a whole stack of people, some very famous, you know, music journalists and TV presenters, no names, no pactorial here. And anyway, Sky didn't like any of them. So I was like, oh, we're going to lose this. This isn't going to happen. And I remember bowling into WizKid, which was my company at the time. And Lisa, who was my MD and very much my right arm at the time, said, Malcolm, sit down. I've got something to tell you. And I said, what? She said, I forget who was the last name we'd proposed to be the presenter. Let's call him Mr. X. Sky Arts have come back and said they're not keen on Mr. X, but they've come up with a solution. And I said, well, what's that? She said, you. They want you to do this. I went, oh, no. I haven't presented on. I used to do a kids show on Tyne, and I said, I can't do this. And she said, well, you know, they're quite insistent. And can we go there tomorrow and have a meeting with them? So anyway, you know, Phil, who oozes charm, you know, I remember where did we go? Oh no, he was having a meeting. He was having a meeting with somebody at the Dorchester, of all people. So we didn't go to the studio. We went to the Dorchester, and he basically persuaded me to do this. And he was like, I'm going to make you a star. I said, no, I don't want to become a star. And he said, please say yes. So anyway, we did it. But in a funny way, basing the show on the Actors Studio was a blessing and a burden, because we tried to stick to that artist's, you know, we try to stick to that format. And if I was to do it again, I would have done it in a more relaxed way. But there was something about it actually which worked at that time, because when we approached Nile Rodgers or Robert Plant or Blondie, whoever it was, Earth, Wind and Fire, they all knew the show, the Actors Studio, and they loved the show, because it gave them the time to have a conversation, not an interview. And that was the thing I learned from the director of the Actors Studio. He said, what you're seeing when you watch that show is about 20% of what actually happened with Brad Pitt, you know, or whoever it might be, Meryl Streep, you know. And I said, so they have a long interview, and then they cut. He said, exactly. So I asked him, would you come over and direct the show? And he said, yeah. And he said, we'll do exactly the same as we do in the States. And that was really why we got such, you know, some really great stuff out of them, because it was a conversation. It wasn't meant as an interview. And if you watch, you know, the Nile Rodgers one, I mean, we couldn't stop him. I mean, after 3 hours and 20 minutes, whatever it was, he was still wanting to talk, you know, and he kept saying things in the interview, you know, oh, I don't think I've ever said that before. I don't know whether I might get into trouble for that, you know. And that's when you know you've got something pretty special. Again, with Jeff, you know, we pleaded with Jeff just to bring a guitar along in case he wanted to pick it up, because I'd known Jeff. He did the title music for me for The Tube. He did the soundtrack to a TV series, a scripted series we made called Frankie's House, and won the BAFTA for that. So we had a great relationship, and he hates interviews, Jeff. He was the shyest man on the planet. And he said, I'll only do it, Malcolm, if you do the interview. And I said, it's not an interview, Jeff. It's a conversation. It might go on all evening. Really? Can I have a beer? I said, do whatever you want. Yes, it's fine. But please bring your guitar. No, I'm not bringing the guitar. I'm not playing. That's a whole different ballgame. I said, but I just know, I've watched you. You know, whenever we meet, you're going to pick that guitar up and talk. So anyway, we persuaded him. And that's why that whole sequence, which has got, I don't know how many views now on social media, hundreds of thousands, when he just picked up the guitar and did Little Wing by Hendrix. And I mean, you could hear the audience just going, oh, this is magic, And that was completely unrehearsed, He said, oh, no, I'm just going to show, the different sounds you can get. That's it. No, I mean, once he picks the guitar up, he can't stop. And when he did that, and he didn't even say what it was. He was messing and noodling around. And then you heard those opening chords. And I thought, oh my God, and it's not an easy thing to play, and he smashed it. And you just talk about goosebumps. I mean, my God, hairs on the back of your neck.
I mean, people like Jeff Beck, these stars with this immense status and quality, and who have accompanied us in our lives, they look for trust in an interviewer, don't they? And I always find that there's two ways that you can get trust. It's through reputation. With you, obviously, this massive history, this reputation from what you've done, that there's an instant trust. And the other trust is when you open up to them and you give part of yourself to allow them to open up as well. And I think it's fascinating that, your career has taken so many different levels, but in the end, there are all these factors that we talked about at the beginning, the anarchy, the trust, the team, the children and the team, building a team, the openness. Don't like the word diversity, but diversity in that period, incredibly important. And it's been your life. These qualities have been your life. And it's been fascinating talking to you, Malcolm. And I have the utmost respect, because you weren't an artist, but in a sense you were, because what you made changed lives, changed my life, definitely, because it gave me the impulse to do something I'd never really thought about before, because along came this anarchic TV show and I thought, oh, I want to be part of that. And if not that, something else. And I think you did that to so many people. So I want to thank you for this amazing cultural contribution that you have done in your life. It's amazing. So Malcolm Gerrie, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much, Steve. I'm humbled by those words. I really am.
Up there is an interview I recommend. Down there is where you can find all the podcast interviews. And here is where you can connect.